We are now in study session 9, Socialism, its meaning and development. Introduction. In this study session, we will introduce you to socialism. In the course of the study session, attention will focus on the meaning of the concept and how it developed. When you have studied this session, you should be able to define and use correctly the keyword printed in bold letters. Describe the elements of socialism. Describe the intellectual history of socialism and identify the various brands of socialism down the centuries. Since the 19th century, socialism has come to be identified as that political doctrine which insists that ownership and control of the means of production and distribution should be vested in the community and utilized for all members of the community. For this reason, it is now widely agreed that an accurate definition of socialism or a socialist state must include at least 3 elements. Let us take you through each of these elements. Public ownership and control of the means of production. This is one of the required elements in the definition of socialism. Socialism preaches that the means of production, capital, land, and property should be owned and controlled jointly by the public and not by private individuals. Public ownership, as opposed to private ownership, is brought about in several ways, namely, through nationalization, in which government takes over existing business concerns, or through cooperatives, when groups of individuals are formed and are left to control such business. While, as stated before, public ownership is central to the definition of socialism, what is still debatable is whether such ownership must be total. Experience in this century has shown that even for countries that have publicly identified themselves with socialism, such public ownership of the means of production is not total. For instance, while in the period between 1958 and 1965, the share of the socialist sector in the gross industrial production in China, Czechoslovakia, North Korea, and Yugoslavia was 100%. It was 85.7% in the German Democratic Republic, 95.5% in Hungary, and 99.5% in Bulgaria, among others. Similarly, while the share of the socialist sector in the gross agricultural production was 100% in North Korea, 99.9% in the USSR, 99.6% in Bulgaria, it was only 15% in Yugoslavia, and 12.2% in Poland. Given all this, what you need to note at this stage is that, generally, private ownership and control of the means of production is frowned upon in socialism. The emphasis is on public ownership, even if not full public ownership. Public ownership and or control of the means of distribution. Socialism goes one step further to argue for state intervention in the distribution of the produce of society. In this regard, socialism upholds the need to narrow the gap between those who have and those who do not have. The basic assumption is that there is a bottom line to poverty and that every individual should have a share of the produce of the society big enough to ensure a comfortable existence. In other words, distribution of goods and services is not left to market forces alone. Rather, it is regulated by the state in order to ensure that it does not lead to gross inequalities of consumption. A goal of bringing about an egalitarian society. Socialism pledges itself to the creation of a society of equals in which there will be freedom from wants. Thus, it hopes to create a new society based on cooperation and equality. These are the three elements in the definition of socialism. Any definition of socialism or a socialist experiment must therefore contain the three elements. This is because socialism does not merely talk about the production process or the distribution of what is so produced. Rather, socialism also talks of bringing about a new society. In essence, a socialist state must not only pledge itself to upholding and encouraging public ownership of the means of production and distribution, it must equally pledge itself to the task of bringing about an egalitarian society in which individuals will be free from material wants. African socialism. Some first-generation African post-independence leaders embraced the ideology of African socialism. Its major advocates include Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Leopold Sedar Senghor of Senegal, Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea, Tom Mboya of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Modibo Keïta of Mali, and so many more. They viewed this ideology as a device for articulating and solving the problems of the new states, chiefly for political stability and legitimacy and of economic development. The ideology was also seen as a means of asserting non-alignment in the struggle between two world ideological blocs, the Western capitalism versus Marxist, that is, socialism. African socialism derives from the pre-colonial cultural practices of Africa. Ideas such as the practice of communalism, egalitarianism, the values of brotherhood and kinship, and respect for the humanism of the individual. The group takes precedence over any of its parts, but it should be noted that the practice of African socialism was a flop. It neither improved production relations nor did it enthrone equity. Furthermore, most countries that proclaimed themselves socialist in Africa have since abandoned this ideology under the combined pressure of civil society, Western countries, and international financial institutions and donor agencies. They have even been compelled to adopt the principles of liberal democracy and the accompanying capitalist ideology. The development of socialism. The origin of socialism can be traced back to France in the pre-revolutionary period before 1789 and to the writing of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher. Several of the ideas that later developed into socialism are traceable to this philosopher. Some of these ideas can be briefly highlighted. They include fears over unequal accumulation of property and the idea of an organic society. In his writings, Rousseau expressed his belief that it was wrong for a few individuals to amass large amounts of property, as was increasingly becoming the case in the dawn of the industrial age. According to him, great inequalities of wealth were bound to create equally great inequalities in the sharing of political power. All this subsequently will put democratic government in jeopardy. For him, therefore, economic equality was a sine qua non for political equality. In the second sense, Rousseau expressed the belief that man was a social animal. In other words, man acquired his human elements only by being a member of the society. For that reason, human welfare was tied irrevocably to that of society, to the extent that the individual could not be distinguished from the whole society. For that reason, the interests of the individual were identical with those of the group. The first stirrings of violent socialism, or anarchist socialism, were recorded in the period preceding the 1789 French Revolution and up to about 1797. In that period, another French writer, Noël Babeuf, along with Louis Blanqui, wrote in favor of abolishing private property and the setting up of a communist state. They argued that the people would have to be led in this fight against private property by an elite corps of conspirators. Even after the French Revolution, they continued to espouse the need for their own kind of revolution. For this, Babeuf was arrested and was beheaded in 1796. For the next few decades, anarchist socialism was eclipsed by utopian socialism. A few decades into the 19th century, however, anarchic socialism was holding sway again, courtesy of writing of people like Perry Joseph Proudhon and Michael Bakunin. Proudhon, who died in 1865, called for the abolition of property and the state. The two, according to him, were instruments with which rulers perpetuated their rule and hindered individual development. On his part, Bakunin, who died in 1876, exalted those who were outcast in society, that is, the vagabonds, the unemployed, and the poor, to rise against such a society which allowed a situation in which they could go to waste. For him, in such a circumstance, there was joy in destruction. Anarchic socialism unleashed a vivid chain of terror while it lasted. The reactions that follow its methods, however, ensured that its impact will be short-lived, since acts like assassinations, riots, and mass murder could not but attract swift, equally violent reprisals from the state. As we indicated earlier, the period immediately after Babeuf's death and after the French Revolution witnessed the emergence of utopian socialism. Among the leading proponents of this school were Claude Henry Saint-Simon, a Frenchman, Robert Owen, a Briton, and Charles Fourier, an American. The utopians believed that it was possible to create an ideal social system in which egalitarianism will be the order of the day. They therefore set about creating concrete examples of such systems in real life. These experiments subsequently failed, paving the way to the emergence, first of the second generation of anarchist socialists like Proudhon, and later to the emergence of Marx's brand of signified socialism. Let us make one point clear at this moment. Karl Marx was not the founder of socialism. Before him, socialism had been underscored by humanitarianism, with socialists being driven to act by the hope that people could treat each other in a more humane way. Moreover, it was held that socialism was an option that people ought to adopt in order to develop themselves and create a better life. However, Marx's influence was so great that he could be said to have subsequently altered the fate of socialism for good. He founded Marxism, the doctrine that will be introduced to you in the next study session. After Marx, however, socialism assumed new dimensions. First, the driving force of socialism was no longer humanitarianism or concern for the poor per se. Rather, Marx propounded a scientific socialism in which certain laws determined the thoughts and deeds of human beings with scientific precision. According to him, it was the material conditions of individuals that determined their consciousness and actions. The working class, therefore, had to be led to develop revolutionary consciousness before they could be expected to attempt to change such material conditions and create socialist society. In this regard, he helped to organize the first Socialist International Organization in 1864. This was an international organization of socialists. It cut across national boundaries and sought to unite socialists under the socialist banner, subduing feelings of nationalism and sectionalism. The first Socialist International collapsed about 12 years later due to quarrels within it, harassment by governments, and the death of Marx. The Second International, organized by Marx's friends, Engels, died with the First World War, while the Third International was dominated by Communist Russia under Stalin. The death of Stalin and the emergence of strong socialist parties in Western Europe after the Second World War led in the 1950s to a thawing in the international socialist movement. Since then, socialist parties in Western Europe, especially Italy and France, have had to develop strategies peculiar to their circumstances. They have, for instance, had to seek political power through active participation in elections rather than by revolution or violence. By the 1980s, the French Socialist Party had succeeded in getting François Mitterrand elected president of France. Another development that was witnessed from the 1950s was the emergence of a socialist movement known as African socialism. Beginning from Senegal's Leopold Sedar Senghor and spreading to Tanzania's Julius Nyerere, proponents of African socialism tended to be heads of state or government in the newly independent states of Africa. African socialism sought to portray socialism as being native to Africa. In this regard, it pointed to the age-long communalism of African society, in which the individual was adequately taken care of by the community. African socialism therefore proposed the reinforcement of these traditional practices in modern times. It is not surprising that proponents of African socialism have come under attack, not only from non-socialists but also from socialists alike. They are accused of trying to resuscitate practices that are better left dead. They are also accused of trying to paint an idyllic picture of such a past in order to encourage crisis-free political cultures in their own domain. All this has not dampened the convictions of those who believe in African socialism. Socialism has thus developed from the doctrine upheld by a few in 17th and 18th century in Europe to an idea upheld in various forms all over the world in the 20th century. This study session observed that socialism is a political doctrine that insists that ownership and control of the means of production and distribution should be vested in the community and utilized for all members of the community. Its three major propositions, therefore, are that there be public ownership and control of the means of production, that the distribution of what is so produced be subject to state control, and the state pledge itself to the eradication of poverty and want. The study session also noted that as a body of ideas, socialism emerged from the writing of Rousseau. It has since developed along several lines. For instance, in the period during the French Revolution, there emerged a brand of socialism that was anarchic and which re-emerged later in the works of Proudhon and Bakunin. Another brand, which sought to found idyllic egalitarian communities in real life, was followed by the scientific socialism of Marx, which spawned not only scientific laws, but also the First to the Third Internationals. Developments after the Second World War have credited socialist movements in Western Europe and Africa for their own peculiarities.